My name is Monica Hubel, and I'm one of the graduate students that was fortunate enough to have Dr. Priscilla Clarkson as a mentor during her lifetime. It was a great honor for me. Last year, I had one of the greatest honors of my life in delivering the inaugural Priscilla M. Clarkson lecture, and am grateful for that. And I'm honored this year to be able to introduce somebody who's been a role model for me, both as a graduate student and then in my career, Dr. Eric Rawson. So Eric told me he has about 182 slides, so I'll keep it short. Eric's a professor and department chair at Bloomsburg University. He's known as an excellent teacher, teaching multiple classes in metabolism, sports nutrition, etc. One of the things that he has done that's unique is really embrace social media. And if you look on the Twitter feed for ACSM, he's one of the top 5 drivers of interest in the Twitter ACSM hashtag, and he's right behind ACSM News. So #1 individual. Eric's he's very in demand as a speaker, doing more than 100 invited presentations regionally, nationally, and internationally. Published more than 40 articles. He's co-authored 3 books, multiple book chapters. He's been a part of more than 30 grants and has been funded by NIH and NSCA and various other entities. One of the things I want to say is he joined ACSM in 1996. So this is the 20-year anniversary of him being involved in ACSM, and one of the things that I've looked up to as a role model is his involvement in ACSM. So I'm super involved in ACSM in large part due to Priscilla Clarkson, but also in large part due to Eric Rawson. He is currently on the board of trustees, rotating off this year. He's been the regional chapter president of Mid-Atlantic, and he's been on multiple committees, including program committee and others. So it's my great honor to introduce Dr. Eric Rawson.
Thank you. Welcome to Boston. I'm honored to have been asked to deliver this presentation, and a special thank you to Monica for a very, very generous introduction. So, the Clarkson lecture is supposed to be about a topic that Priscilla had a great passion for. And last year, Monica delivered the inaugural Clarkson lecture and talked about exercise-induced muscle damage. Priscilla's other passions had to do with nutrition and how it interacted with skeletal muscle in response to training and in response to damaging exercise. Now, in structuring today's talk, I had to think a bit about where to begin. So I thought the best place to begin was a little bit over 20 years ago, and that's where and when Priscilla and I met. Now, she was an extraordinary individual, and we met at the University of Massachusetts in the early 1990s. So if we can go back in time to give you a feel for what we were thinking about and what we were interested in studying back then, we need to start with this guy. Now, this individual is obviously very confused. In fact, it's probably difficult to know what he's actually thinking about. But this young man approached Priscilla Clarkson over 20 years ago, and he said, "I like nutrition, you like nutrition. I like muscle, you like muscle. I think I should be in your lab." And she said, "Go to the lab, find an empty desk, start coming to our laboratory meeting on Monday, get a haircut." Now, Priscilla was an extraordinary woman. She was probably the most unique person I've ever met in my life. She was all about the science. But what neither one of us realized at the time was that I was a bit unique myself. I was filled with what I thought was scientific knowledge that was really quite a bit of legend, quite a bit of lore from the many years I had spent in the gyms and being an athlete myself. So, a typical conversation between Priscilla and I back then would be me saying something colorful like, "In powerlifting, if you can see your abs, you're not eating enough." And I thought that was science. And Priscilla was there to train me to the point where I could say things a bit better, like, future studies should investigate this hypothesis. But over the years, what developed in my perspective on sport nutrition and muscle adaptations was kind of a split personality. You had this individual who'd spent, at this point in time, over 35 years in the gym as a practitioner and as an athlete, and you're trying to build this scientist, and at times these two voices in my head were always arguing. So we have two different individuals, two Dr. Rossens, so to speak. The Dr. Rossen who Priscilla was trying to develop was made to be a researcher. He was trained in the hallowed halls of the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He did research on human volunteers. He was aiming for a PhD. And he never would advise you to do anything unless there was an enormous amount of empirical evidence to support it. So do as I say, but only when it was well supported. The other guy who constantly butted heads with Priscilla, the other Dr. Rossen, was an athlete and a practitioner. He got all his research done in the gym. He experimented on himself, sometimes brutally and sometimes on his own friends. He had what we call a PhD in gym pharmacology, which really doesn't hold up when you're trying to publish later in your career. Now, at that point in time, I would tell people, I know this works, I have no evidence, I do it, but probably don't do it yourself. And trying to resolve these two characters has guided me over the last 20 years in sport nutrition. So some of the simple arguments that all of us have, whether you're a practitioner, an athlete, or a researcher, still exist today. You know, more protein, the science says that's just going to get oxidized. Whey protein is number one, soy protein is useless. Some people think that all proteins are really the same. I feel better on creatine. How? That doesn't make any physiologic sense. What's the research? Protein for weight loss or dietary fat to suppress your appetite? Creatine is safe. No, we need more data. And the two voices continue to argue even to this day. Now, today's topic, what are the best nutritional practices to promote optimal muscular adaptations for strength and power athletes? This meeting is filled with glorious research about running marathons, so I'm going to take a stand and be the guy who gets to talk about strength, power, and hypertrophy. First, before we actually talk about the practices, we have to define what a strength and power athlete is. Now, if we all close our eyes for a moment and imagine a strength and power athlete, we're probably going to come up with something that looks like this. This is basically a large, heavy man picking up a large, heavy object with a wonderful tattoo in his armpits that actually says "The Beast." That's definitely a strength and power athlete, but it's worth remembering that strength and power athletes are not all the same. For instance, here's two strength and power athletes who are interested in strength, power, muscle hypertrophy, muscle size, but they're radically different individuals. They have different goals in terms of body composition. So perhaps we should have different nutritional approaches to different individuals, such as Logan Mankins and Mr. Olympia Phil Heath. Here's two athletes who undergo the same metabolic demands because they're in the same sports, but they're driven to perform differently and to diet and supplement differently based on the demands of their weight classes. Heavyweight Roy Nelson, featherweight champ Conor McGregor. Whether we're talking about athletes in the off season or in competitive mode, there are completely different nutritional needs. So saying something like an athlete is a strength and power athlete is a bit of a misnomer. Strength and power athletes come in all sizes. They have remarkably different metabolic demands, and they have different goals in terms of strength, different goals in terms of muscle size, different goals in terms of skill development. And the skill aspect in a strength and power athlete is probably the hardest one to connect to nutritional practices. Now this is a strength and power athlete, but that takes quite a bit of skill. I'm going to watch that again. Ouch. So really, the question is, what are the goals of the athlete? Now, we don't have the time today, but we could do an entire talk on strength, power, muscle hypertrophy in older athletes as well. This slide shows some of the more famous older athletes. On the top left, you have the world record holder in the over 100-year-old category. He ran the 142.22 seconds that day. In the middle, on the bottom, you have the world's oldest bodybuilder. And I always like to point out this young woman right here, because a lot of people think that that image is photoshopped when they see it on the internet, but it's not. Now, perhaps another talk we can go through strength and power athletes and aging populations, but today we're going to focus mostly on the young ones. So what are the best nutritional practices to promote optimal muscular adaptations for strength and power athletes? It depends upon the context, and you have to keep that in mind throughout today's talk, because I'm going to generalize a lot, but the answer to your question may be very, very different if you're talking about an older athlete, a weight-restricted athlete, or an athlete who competes in a very, very unique sport like mixed martial arts. Now, I'm going to focus on two nutrients, and the first one is protein. I don't know if you're aware of this, but the front row is aware of this because we were graduate students with Priscilla Clarkson, and she made us go to museums as graduate students, and plays, and the ballet, and she made us read books that weren't even science. We called them cultural credits. So as a tribute to Priscilla, I present to you from 1858, written by Walt Whitman under his pseudonym Mose Velsor, the Manly Health and Training Guide, which was only recently discovered. But to give you an idea of how long people have been interested in protein and touting the benefits of protein, you can go back to this document on manly health written by Whitman, and you'll find that breakfast, to make a hearty man, probably consists of a whole plate full of fresh, rare meat. Dinner, guess what? That should consist of a plate of meat as well. Priscilla would be thrilled that I knew who Walt Whitman was, except that someone else had to tell me first. So let's talk a bit about protein, because over the years we've had a lot of discussion and a lot of arguments about protein. The athletes always seem to think they need more. The scientists can prove that that's wasteful. Athletes think supplements are better than food. Dietitians think food is better than supplements. People think protein makes them stronger. Scientists say that training makes you stronger. Athletes are always trying to up the per-serving dose. Scientists don't quite know what the exact dose is. As an athlete, I think if you want to lose weight, you should be focusing on protein, but the science seems to be really heavily investigating dietary fat. I think whey's greater than soy, and some scientists will tell you there's no difference, it's just all amino acids in the blood. And the argument goes on and on. So I'd like to go through some of these points and talk about where we started 20 years ago and where we are now. Now first, you have the general guideline for a physically active person, recommended about 1.6 or 1.7 grams per kg per day of dietary protein. Two excellent reviews have summarized what athletes actually eat in terms of dietary protein. And there's some wonderful research indicating that athletes are ingesting up to 400 grams per day, which is 4.3 grams per kg, or 40% of energy requirements. In some athletes, this is really going to displace carbohydrate intake and probably wind up creating an ergolytic effect. In other athletes, they're sure that this is the way to go. Why are athletes so fascinated by protein? It's because they've always believed it's the key to higher levels of strength and muscle mass, okay? Some people think too much, some people think just right. Well, let's talk about strength. I think one of the most important articles on the benefits of protein was published by Cermak and colleagues in 2012. And if you remember how these forest plots work, everything to the right of the vertical line means a positive effect of protein, and this is on 1 repetition maximal leg press strength in both younger and older adults. And you can see that in hard training groups who are already ingesting quite a bit of protein, when you add protein to their diet, it improves their strength even more. I think this is important because of the large variability in the response to strength training itself. If you can add more protein to a high protein diet and get an even greater improvement in strength, I think that speaks volumes about the power of protein. Now, a more recent study, this is from Jeremy Lenicky down at Old Miss Muscle, took a very unique approach to this, and they looked at strength and lean mass as it relates to the dose of protein per meal. And as you can see, if we follow the top lines and looked at muscle strength, that the more protein you eat per meal on a population level, this is not an intervention study, that's associated with greater knee extension strength. So in some ways, it seems like the athletes were right all along. The per dose recommendations maybe need to be increased a little bit, as well as the per day recommendations. Now, exactly what is the dose? We're not quite sure. Now, I think you're going to learn a lot more about the exact dose of protein necessary to increase muscle protein synthesis from Stu Phillips. He has several talks on Friday that'll focus on the newest data on protein, and I'm just giving you kind of a basic introduction here. I'd say somewhere around 30 grams per meal, maybe higher, we'll see later, or maybe 0.3 grams per kg, something that's loaded with essential amino acids, especially leucine. If you feed it in a dose response, eventually it'll plateau and you'll get maximal muscle protein synthesis, and beyond that point, you'll simply increase protein oxidation. So the muscles kind of get full. Now, if you ask any athlete if 30 grams per serving is adequate, most of them will tell you no, they need more, but that's just not what the science supports at this point. About 30 grams, at least up until this morning, seems to be as much as most people can handle. Is 20 or 25 grams really enough? I'll point you to an excellent study if you're interested in protein that compared 10-gram doses versus 20-gram doses versus a 40-gram bolus. This is every 6 hours, this is every 3 hours, and assessed muscle protein synthesis. And what you can see is that the 20 grams per serving resulted in a larger increase in muscle protein synthesis than the 40 grams per serving. So it tells you that possibly, at least in young healthy athletes, we're maybe approaching the maximal dose that the body can handle before it just becomes wasteful. Now, measuring protein synthesis is very, very complicated. And I think protein synthesis is interesting because it's easy to trigger an improvement in protein synthesis. You can basically work out, drink a glass of milk, and really augment muscle protein synthesis. But muscle protein breakdown is a bit harder to tinker with. Now, there are some scientists who say that athletes could probably be consuming up close to 300 grams per day. Athletes will tell you they've been eating like this for years, and the scientists will tell you there's really no evidence to support this. There's one paper that I think is interesting, and I hope Stu discusses this later on in the meeting, and that's from Bob Wolf's team. And in this investigation, instead of comparing 10 to 20 to 40, they compared 40 to 70, and they assessed protein synthesis and protein breakdown. And they arrive at a net balance number. And in terms of net balance, the balance was best achieved with the higher dose of protein. So 70 grams per serving is necessary to augment protein breakdown, where maybe 25 or 30 is enough to augment protein synthesis. This is a very, very small amount of research at this moment. And again, I encourage you to attend anything that Stu Phillips' name is on later in the meeting to get the most up-to-date information. Now, athletes have always had their preferential proteins, particularly beef protein, more recently whey protein, and soy protein has never been one that's been of great interest. And I think the problem here doesn't come from the research. The research is fantastic, but it's how you actually rate a protein, how you assess a protein and say that one is better than another. For instance, soy protein is digested much faster than casein. And in at least one investigation, whey protein is always going to come out at the top, but soy protein caused a greater increase in muscle protein synthesis than casein. And most athletes would be shocked to see this graph. Now, does that mean that soy is better than milk protein, casein? Not necessarily. It's a bit more complicated than that because we're not just looking at muscle protein synthesis. We're looking at hypertrophy, we're looking at strength outcomes and changes in body composition as well. The functional studies have to be connected to the really elegant laboratory-based studies. So if we extend this work and compare something like milk, fat-free milk, to soy, you actually get a greater increase in type 1 and type 2 fiber cross-sectional area and a greater increase in fat-free mass, with milk being better than soy. And I think the problem here is that there's different ways to identify the quality of a protein. And at times, I think we're oversimplifying. So one of my favorite review articles, and I think this should be required reading for everyone who has an interest in nutrition, was published in the Journal of Food Science by Stu's team in 2015. Look at the different ways you can actually rate a protein. Are they complete proteins? Yes, 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 and no. Does that mean these are really all equal? What about digestibility? Fast, slow, fast, fast. Does that really mean milk protein is in last place? Not necessarily. Leucine content, high, moderate, low. Does that really mean that collagen is worse than whey? Probably. I think what's most important is something like splanchnic amino acid extraction. Where do the amino acids go after you ingest the protein? Are they dedicated to muscle protein synthesis or to protein synthesis in other tissues? In this case, I would say soy, although it's very rapidly digested, is too low in leucine and too high in splanchnic amino acid extraction to really be of benefit, but only under certain circumstances. And if you go to this paper and you look at this wonderful figure on intracellular leucine incorporation, you'll find that to achieve a leucine threshold necessary for optimal adaptation, this is easy to get with whey protein at 25 grams. It's hard to get with soy protein or rice protein. But of course, if you double the amount of soy protein or rice protein, you can get to that level. So what does this mean? Maybe for a well-fed, large athlete, it really doesn't matter. But maybe for an athlete in a weight-restricted sport who's on a hypocaloric diet, maybe whey is a much better choice for them than soy. I don't think we're really sure at this point. Now, we want to talk about this right here. A tiny amount of whey protein with a lot of leucine appears to offer great benefit. And there are multiple comparisons in this study, but the important one is 25 grams of whey, which has naturally 3 grams of leucine, versus 6 grams of whey with leucine added. And in terms of these comparisons, the greatest level of muscle protein synthesis comes from those two conditions. So a little bit of protein with a lot of leucine, or a good amount of whey protein seems to be your best option. But I think it has to be context specific. And of course, I'm never going to advocate that anyone chooses a dietary supplement, particularly a single amino acid, over food. There are a lot of high-dose leucine foods that are readily available. But I think we have to remember that nutrition isn't just about physiology, it's also a behavior. What will your athletes actually consume? What will your patients actually eat? If it's a matter of convenience, then you have to give them a whey protein shake if you can't get them to consume cottage cheese or chicken or a healthier food choice. But it's always worth reminding people that we don't eat nutrients, we actually eat food. And in fact, we don't just eat food, we eat meals. And there's a lot more in the meals than just protein. Now, I want to talk just for a moment about weight loss. Every year when I teach my undergraduate sport nutrition course, I hear myself say something about dietary fat being important for satiety. And I actually hadn't read anything in years except the general knowledge that was in the textbook. So I challenged myself to go back and look at the research on what happens when we add dietary fat to an individual's diet, particularly with the volume that I'm exposed to from the low carbohydrate, high fat people. They're screaming that fat is the ingredient, and I think it might be a different case. I went back and I found this wonderful paper from 1987 and tried to remind myself what is the important nutrient here when it comes to appetite suppression and weight control. The methods in this study are absolutely exquisite. They prepared all of the food for their research volunteers, and they manipulated the fat content of the food so it could not be perceived by the research volunteers. So in other words, these people were on high-fat, moderate-fat, or low-fat diets and didn't know what group they were in because it was within the food preparation. 15 to 20% fat, low fat, 30 to 35 moderate, 45 to 50, a high-fat diet. What happened when they put these people on a high-fat diet? People on the low-fat diet lost weight, the people on the moderate-fat diet maintained their weight, and the people on the high-fat diet gained fat. So I'm starting to wonder if the benefits of a low-carbohydrate, high-fat diet are only there when you know you're on a low-carbohydrate, high-fat diet. And I think the ingredient here that really should be the focus is protein. Protein for weight loss. One final paper from Stu's group. 245 grams of protein per day versus 116. But look at the per unit body weight numbers. The control group's eating a lot of protein. The protein group's really eating a lot of protein. This was on a hypocaloric diet. They were in an extreme caloric deficit. They were doing resistance training and high-intensity interval training in an effort to lose weight. What happened? In terms of lean mass, the very high protein group increased, and in terms of fat mass, the very high protein group decreased more. So I think it's time maybe we revisited the concept that dietary fat is actually the nutrient that's satisfied, and maybe under certain conditions, maybe in hard training athletes who are trying to make weight, we really should be looking at replacing some of the fat in their diet, or possibly some of the carbohydrate, but it's probably going to have to be with protein. Protein satisfies. Now, the nutrient that I spent most of my career studying is creatine, and in particular the dietary supplement creatine monohydrate. And for the past 20 years, we've had the same arguments back and forth between the athletic community, the practitioners, and the researchers. Athletes are big fans of creatine. Researchers sometimes doubt that it works in every instance. Spoken with my Boston accent, creatine's the best supplement ever. Whereas scientists say, what's the big deal? It's only involved in like one chemical reaction in the whole body. I say improved sport performance. You clarify and say, no, improved laboratory exercise performance. That's not the same thing. Increased strength, but no improvement in skill. Better recovery. People don't really understand how. I feel better when I take creatine. What does that even mean? So the arguments on creatine have been going on for about 20 years, and I'd like to go through a few of these, including some safety concerns as well. First, I think undoubtedly creatine monohydrate supplementation increases muscle strength. We published this review some time ago that looked at maximal strength in resistance training individuals ingesting either creatine monohydrate or a placebo, and we looked at repetitions to failure with a percentage of maximal strength in individuals resistance training and ingesting creatine or a placebo, and there are really large differences between those people training when they use creatine monohydrate and those individuals ingesting a placebo. This is clear. Now, when we wrote this paper, we were trying to select the most homogeneous population possible, young, healthy training individuals, so we could see if creatine actually improved muscle strength. And this is a narrative review. A more recent review is a meta-analysis published in 2015. So we have a sample size of about 1,300, and the common strength measurement was lower limb strength. And again, if you remember how these forest plots work, everything to the right of the vertical line means creatine increases strength. And this is maximal weight lifted in the squat, and this is maximal weight lifted in the leg press. Now, why I think this article is important isn't just because it demonstrates, again, that creatine makes you stronger. Look at the populations. Sedentary, recreationally trained, competitive trained, 20 years old, 65 years old, 69 years old. In this paper, instead of trying to get the volunteers who were most alike, they selected the most heterogeneous groups they could And with all that noise, creatine still increases muscle strength across all different populations who are exercising and ingesting creatine. I don't think there's any doubt that creatine can augment muscle strength, which is very valuable for athletes and patient populations alike. The question of sports performance is a bit more sticky, but there are papers published, and I think people have forgotten some of these. This is from Louise Burke's team, and this is a fantastic study on soccer players, or football players if you must. Elite athletes, 20 grams per day. They found significant improvements in sprinting and in some agility runs, but not in precision ball kicking. They didn't find any effect. Now, how does this translate into sports performance? I think if you go back and look at this paper, the authors did something fantastic, and that was convert their improvements in times into distance traveled. Now, if you know anything about soccer, if you have a 30 centimeter or a 70 centimeter head start on someone when you get by them with the ball, that's improved sports performance. Any elite soccer player in the world would be thrilled with that advantage. But to a scientist, these look like very, very minor improvements. On the soccer pitch, that's a major difference in sports performance. And there are other papers as well. This is from the team at the University of Sao Paulo with Bruno Gualano as the lead author, where we highlighted a 0.9 second reduction in 100-meter sprint time and a 0.41 second reduction in 6x60-meter sprint time. So that's a real sports performance effect. In swimmers, a 1.8 second decrease in swim time in 2 100-meter swims, and a reminder that the difference between first and 10th in Beijing was actually only 1.07 seconds. To an elite athlete, this matters a lot. To a recreational athlete, maybe not so much. To a patient population, I think absolutely. Now, I'd like to point out a paper that I don't think has gotten enough attention, and that's because it's an acute dose creatine supplementation study. In most cases, creatine is studied in terms of what happens after we load the muscles with it. This is a skill performance study. This is passing accuracy under conditions of sleep deprivation to disrupt coordination and motor function. And if you give someone a little creatine or a little more, or some caffeine, which we would guess, you don't get this sleep deprivation performance decrement. So I think there's a lot more room to study the acute effects of creatine ingestion to augment motor performance. I definitely think this paper should have gotten a bit more attention, as it's been out for over 5 years now. Now, how could creatine make you feel better? Athletes consistently report in surveys that they feel better. A good scientist will tell you that doesn't make any sense at all. Of all the things that creatine does, it's all happening inside the muscle. Now, this is from a summary paper of this year's creatine conference, again with Bruno Gualano as the lead author. I was lucky enough to co-author this paper with Darren Kandow and Phil Chillibeck. And you can see that on its way to improving strength, creatine exerts a lot of functions. Increased GLUT4 translocation, increased AMP kinase, increased intracellular water, which is an anabolic signal, increased gene expression, increased expression of myogenic factors, insulin like growth factor 1, satellite cell activity, but it's all happening inside the muscle. And I think the most fascinating area of creatine research right now is what's happening in the brain. So if you're not familiar with brain creatine, about maybe 4 or 5% of our body's creatine is actually stored in our brain. Now, we know that blood and muscle creatine levels are decreased in vegetarians. We're not really sure if they're drastically decreased in terms of brain levels, because they're just very, very few data. And it looks like the brain can compensate a bit better than muscle to reductions in dietary creatine. We do know that brain creatine goes down as you get older. We know that your performance on the mini mental state exam is highly correlated with your brain creatine levels. And we know that if you train your brain, your muscle creatine levels increase. Now, in 1998, there was a wonderful paper that was published that showed that creatine monohydrate supplementation increases your brain creatine about 10%. I immediately took the paper and ran into Priscilla Clarkson's office, and I said, "See, creatine even makes you smarter." And she threw me out of her office, and about 10 years later, we got down to actually studying creatine in the brain. At this point in time, I think people would be surprised to find out how many creatine cognition studies there actually are. They're difficult to compare. They have different outcomes, different dosing strategies in different populations, but they're very, very positive. The first paper in 2002 showed a reduction in mental fatigue following 8 grams of creatine ingestion per day for 5 days. The second paper improved memory and intelligence on a 6-week protocol. Terry McMorris published 2 papers where they combined stressful exercise and sleep deprivation to disrupt cognitive function, and they were able to attenuate these changes with creatine ingestion. Another paper showed improved cognition on a battery of tests in the elderly, and in these 3 investigations, they didn't find significant improvements in all areas of brain function, but they used a wide battery of tests. Our paper, we used a low-dose strategy, about 2.5 grams per day, didn't find any benefit. One other paper found improved cognitive function, increased memory and reaction time. The training study, again from the group in Brazil, was not able to augment the beneficial effects of exercise with creatine on cognition. And then finally, a fantastic paper from Turner and colleagues, under simulated hypoxia, improved cognitive function subsequent to creatine ingestion. So there's about 11 studies now, and most of them are demonstrating some aspect of improved mood, improved cognition with creatine supplementation. I think there's a lot more work to be done in this area, especially exciting to me is the work being done in concussion, as creatine seems able to protect the brain from traumatic injury. Now, we'll finish up here with safety of creatine. We could talk about kidney stress, which doesn't exist. We could talk about thermoregulation and dehydration, which doesn't exist. But Priscilla Clarkson was a muscle researcher, so I want to talk about creatine and rhabdomyolysis. I'm using my sarcastic font here. Some people think that creatine causes exertional rhabdomyolysis. And each time there's a weird outbreak of rhabdomyolysis, everyone goes on the hunt looking for some sort of dietary supplement. When in fact, these cases seem to be nothing more than brutal exercise protocols forced upon young people. In this case, high school football players were required to do chair dips for 30 seconds, followed by push-ups for 30 seconds. Dips for 20 seconds, push-ups for 20 seconds, dips for 10 seconds, and so on. And then if one person on the team fell out of order and couldn't make it, everybody had to start again. I think that's supposed to build unity in coaching. 92 degrees and water restriction. That's exertional rhabdomyolysis. That's not creatine. Of course, the college football players in Iowa were required to do sets of 100 in the squat. I'd say that's probably unaccustomed exercise. But people aren't really convinced. Now, in 2001 at UMass, we actually investigated the effects of creatine supplementation on exertional rhabdomyolysis. And if you're familiar with Priscilla's biceps model, this is 50 maximal eccentric contractions of the elbow flexors, where someone's standing in front of this individual and forcing this lever down as their muscles lengthen. We've done this on thousands of individuals, and we've compared different topical treatments, different pharmacological treatments, different dietary supplements, and this is an incredible model to actually study exertional rhabdomyolysis, but in a controlled laboratory setting. Now, I've blatantly stolen these images from last year's Clarkson lecture from Monica Hubel, but I think you can see the devastating effects of Priscillas Arm Protocol in terms of inflammation and in terms of loss of range of motion. This individual is actually not bending their arm, it's just stuck like that for a couple weeks. The muscle's so contracted. We were very popular on campus. So we supplemented individuals with creatine monohydrate. We damaged their muscles with Priscilla's protocol, and we got the response we always get, a massive reduction in muscle strength that wasn't completely recovered by day 5 of about 50%, but no difference between the creatine group and the placebo group. 23-degree, 22-degree loss of range of motion around the elbow joint, no difference between groups. 2.5 centimeters of swelling, high rates of soreness, high efflux of creatine kinase and lactate dehydrogenase from the muscles. We really damaged these muscles under the most stressful condition we can induce in a lab. There is no negative effect of creatine in terms of muscle function or exertional rhabdomyolysis. And in fact, there are not any studies that have ever shown that creatine ingestion worsens muscle damage. Now, some people say, well, that's only one study. It was my pleasure to work on one more paper with Priscilla, which is in press at this time in sports medicine, along with Mark Tarnopolsky, on exertional rhabdomyolysis and creatine supplements. And at this point in time, there are 4 studies that have assessed the effects of creatine supplements on markers of muscle damage. They found nothing. There are 3 resistance exercise training studies that have examined the effects of creatine supplementation on muscle damage and rhabdomyolysis, and they either found nothing or that the muscles recovered better. 4 high force eccentric exercise studies, no changes in muscle serum proteins, delayed onset muscle soreness, although one study found improved recovery of function. This might be why athletes say they feel better when they take creatine. Finally, there's endurance and sprint studies, and in every case, they're showing remarkable reductions in muscle serum protein efflux and a variety of different inflammatory markers. So at the very least, I don't think creatine's causing or exacerbating exertional rhabdomyolysis. Now, if Priscilla was here, she'd yell at me because I haven't mentioned the case studies. Plus, she enjoyed yelling at me, okay? So if you still need more data, there are a few case studies where people ingesting creatine actually had rhabdomyolysis. I always encourage people to read the case studies. They can be very, very informative. They're not something to ignore, especially in this case. We have 6 individuals. 4 of them made a full recovery, 1 of them made a partial recovery, and 1 of them actually died from exertional rhabdomyolysis. Now, these articles were presented as if the only commonality was they happened to be ingesting creatine. But if you look at the confounding and mitigating circumstances, there's a lot of other details that you need to pay attention to. One other individual took some time off from the gym and then did a 3-hour workout, needed fasciotomies to release the pressure in his legs. 3 individuals did what they referred to as extreme exercise. They were dehydrated as well as abusing ephedrine. The unfortunate individual who died, this was after an Army physical fitness test. He was obese, he'd undergone rapid weight loss, he was taking natural diuretics, whatever those are, he was dehydrated, ephedrine, African American, so many risk factors for rhabdo and muscle dysfunction that it's unbelievable that creatine would even be mentioned in the paper. And then this individual, possibly my favorite one, he was skiing and he hit a tree. Now, if you know the history of rhabdo, you know that it was originally called a crush injury from the London Blitz, where buildings fell on people. Their muscles were crushed, but they survived, and then 3 days later they died when they went into renal failure. So this was a crush injury. There's also literature on patients undergoing surgery who get rhabdo from tourniquets. And then especially in the gastric bypass literature, very large people who are immobilized can actually cause their own crush injury from their body size. This was a large person, he was hypertensive, he was taking NSAIDs. All of this is a recipe for disaster, but it's not something to ignore. If Priscilla was here, she'd ask for better reporting. She'd ask for better awareness and better education about the dangers of exertional rhabdomyolysis, but I'm still not convinced that creatine had anything to do with any of these cases. Now, before I finish, I need to say that I don't want to give anyone the impression that I think athletes are always right or that scientists are always right. If I think back to some of the ridiculous things that people were ingesting and doing to themselves, myself included, in the 1980s, it's just like a long list of awful bad things. Long, long, long. And when it comes right down to it, we're just left with maybe a handful of dietary supplements that showed promise. And then all the way up to present day with the older Dr. Rawson, we're studying all of these nutritional interventions like low-carb, high-fat diets, the paleo diet, intermittent fasting, train low and compete high. And some of these things have great data to support them. They're very promising. Some of them are maybe a bit more silly. Some of them I don't think work at all. But at the end of the day, we're just going to wind up with a handful of nutritional interventions that actually can be of benefit to the strength and power athlete. So I'm not sure exactly how we wind up in the future. Hopefully not like that guy on the right. But I think this has been a fun process to go through in the past 20 years. And to Priscilla's credit, she never tried to extinguish the athlete or the practitioner side of my brain in lieu of just thinking like a scientist. And I think we're at a wonderful time where we have sports scientists, practitioners, athletes, and researchers really communicating well and answering some of the questions that have been difficult to answer over the many years. So a brief summary, I think at this point in time there's several very valuable dietary modifications that can assist the strength power athlete. We certainly could have a whole talk about buffers and even caffeine. I'm always going to ask athletes to focus on food and not individual nutrients. Anytime an athlete asks me about creatine or protein, I ask them about their training, which makes them furious. But you got to fix your training and your sleep habits before you even consider fixing your nutrition. Be open-minded, read everything you possibly can, use ACSM, follow along on Twitter, and really talk to the experts in the field. Now, if I could take one more minute just to thank a few people. Priscilla was an astonishing mentor. I was so fortunate to have stumbled into her lab and to have her give me that one chance. I'm honored to be able to do this lecture, just like I was honored to be able to study under her. The ACSM Program Committee and the Clarkson Award Committee deemed me worthy of doing this lecture. I thank them. GSSI funded this session, so I thank them. There are a lot of colleagues I could thank, but for now I'm just going to thank the Clarkson Lab alumni who are all in this room. That's Doctors Mary Miles, Adam Persky, Melissa Rohde, and Monica Hubel. These individuals have at different times served as big sister, twin sister, baby sister, big brother, son, dad, but always a constant source of inspiration to me. And here's a picture of them sunning themselves at ACSM in San Diego while I was in the Board of Trustees meeting, suffering. I've been fortunate to mentor hundreds of undergraduate students and dozens of master's students. In particular, I need to thank Courtney Steele, Chuck Brightbill, Michael Steck, and Andy Venezia, who will go on to do great things. And finally, over 20 years ago, Priscilla Clarkson told me to go to my first ACSM meeting. She said, "You have to go. The people are awesome." And that's why I keep coming back. So I thank you for your attention.